afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to begin a new section for our lectures. Specifically, we are going to be talking about ethics within research. This topic, although for many individuals may seem like, oh, it's a boring topic, it's something that may not be necessary. Something that I need you to remember is that luckily, because of ethical standards, we have been able to reduce the level of harm that we can cause to participants. That is one of the tenets, that is one of the things that we usually think of when conducting research. That is actually one of the things that you need to be very concerned with, whether it be in the research side or the practicum side or the practice side of things, because you should be able to reduce the chances of conducting or giving harm to somebody else. Let's get started. Now, you may think, well, why exactly do we need to have ethics? Particularly, this has to deal an awful lot with the type of harm that we have caused historically in the past. Now, there's several examples here, but I would like to cover one of these examples, and that is Nazi medical experiments. Now, many people would argue that a lot of the things that we know today was given and was provided based on the research that we conducted with individuals that were detained and that were unfortunately held against their will, whether it be individuals with a Jewish descent, individuals that have physical deformities, individuals from the LGBT community, people who would be considered Roni currently. So those individuals were unfortunately held against their will. And because of that, they didn't give them the same ethical treatment for experiments. Now, some of the things that we know today that come from these experiments, one of them being starvation, right? How long can a person survive without eating? How long can a person survive with hypothermia? And some people may argue, well, we gained knowledge from this process. However, the issue with that is that those individuals, their rights were infringed upon. These individuals did not have a voluntary say when it came to their participation. The point of ethics is to minimize the chances of this occurring. Any questions about that? Now, something immensely important when it comes to ethics committees. One thing that I need to point out is that universities generally tend to have an ethics committee, right? Generally, it is comprised of with persons that belong to that field, right? Those individuals will review whatever type of research you are proposing, because before you can actually conduct any type of research, it has to be approved by an ethics committee. So not only do you need to worry about standardization, gathering samples from the population, defining your statistical methods and things of that nature, you also have to be approved by an ethics committee. Now, generally, the ethics committee, they are going to review three main aspects. The first aspect I should say, that they're going to be concerned with is the respect for persons. What does that mean? That is that the individual is able to have their autonomy, and they're also able to make informed decisions. So for instance, at the end of the semester, right, you guys have the opportunity to rate yours truly, Dr. Shaw Ortiz. You guys are going to have the opportunity to participate in that evaluation. But in order for you to participate in that type of research, if you will, your autonomy, your ability of making that decision of whether or not you want or you don't want to leave a review for yours truly has to come from your own free will. And that applies to any form of research that is ethically conducted. Not only that, it has to be informed. And when we talk about this term, when we talk about making an informed decision, what are we talking about? We're talking about an informed decision. We are talking about, do you understand, and has it been presented to you clearly what you're getting yourself into, right? You have to be able to know the facts of the study, the purpose, who's in it, who's not in it. What can you do if you're harmed? What if you do if you're distressed? What are your participant rights? Immensely similar to those of patient or client rights. Participants also have rights. You are supposed to get that information beforehand before you decide whether or not you want to participate in a study. Generally, this is given to you in written form. Generally, you have to sign it, basically acknowledging that you understand your rights as a participant. Any questions about that? Yes, ma'am.
What happens if you're illiterate? Is it still in written form?
So, in regards to a person that cannot communicate, right, because they are illiterate, they are still entitled to be told about their rights, right? So in that case, it will be a verbal consent. Generally, in that case, someone that can communicate that to them will, right? And that also applies if the person doesn't speak the language, right? So you should be able to present that information in a way they can understand it. So if the participant only speaks Chinese, you can't say, oh, here's my informed consent in English, because that person needs to be able to understand clearly what they're getting themselves into and what are their rights. So you would relay that information in a way that they can understand. So if they cannot understand written language, they'll be verbally communicated. Right? If they don't understand, if they come from another language background, you will present it in a way they can understand it. Because it's not excusable to say the person was illiterate or the person didn't speak the language that I presented my informed consent in. So that wouldn't be an excuse to violate that person's rights of autonomy in making that decision.
It makes sense. And if you're like, there's a kid who's literate, but they don't have a high reading comprehension, would it have to be like written for them to understand?
Something that I would do there, I would do both. And I would also have the person basically repeat what I said. So that way I know for a fact that they understood what does this mean, what does confidentiality mean. And I will make sure that person indeed understands what's confidentiality, what's duty to minimize harm, right? So I will make sure that that person clearly understands what their rights are and my responsibilities as a researcher and their responsibilities as a participant, right? So I would ask for feedback, right? Repeat and define terms for me, so that way I can understand whether or not they comprehended the terms that I use, for example. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay. Good deal. Another significant aspect of ethics committees is that they have to look into the benefit of your participant being part of your study. And what do I mean by that? We have to guarantee that we're going to minimize the amount of risk, and more so, we also need to maximize the benefits of our study. So what does that mean? If I am conducting a study, who can tell me a mental health topic or a mental health issue? Any sort of topic. OCD. Say I'm conducting a study about individuals who have been formally diagnosed with OCD in the past 5 years, right? And we conduct a study, and during the study, this person, say for example, is feeling a high level of distress. Myself as a researcher, I have to be able to foresee those potential limitations that could cause harm to that person. Not only that, what am I doing to minimize that before it happens, and if it were to occur during the experiment and the research process? Also, what are the gains for this person, this OCD participant? What are the benefits for this person? And how can I make them greater? And also the benefits for the greater society, right? If I am studying OCD, I need to ensure that my study does have a purpose in the general OCD population, right? Another thing that we need to concern ourselves with is justice. I want to make sure that all my participants are treated fairly and there is a level of equity. Can anybody here define what equity means? As a general idea. Yes, ma'am.
It's sort of like equality, but better. So it's like, oh, I don't forget it. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
But it's related to equality.
Okay, so it is related to equality. And we're thinking about fairness. We're thinking about basically leveling the field, right? So what's your last name again?
Bacon. Bacon, like the food.
What's your first name?
Kate.
Kate. So Dr. Kate over here, right? She was asking us about, say, for example, we have someone who's illiterate. Right? I want to be fair to that person in terms of their participation and their consent. So equity would mean leveling the field. You can't read my informed consent, but I'm going to provide you the same level of understanding of your consent as I would other people, right? Because I want to make it fair, right? I want to make sure that I'm treating each participant the same way. Any questions about that? Fantastic. Now, something that I would like to mention is some examples that we have on ethical focus when it comes to our field, the field of psychology. Now, one of the studies that I would like to mention is that of the Roberts Cave experiment. Now, the background of this specific experiment involved two groups of boys, and they were brought to this cave in Oklahoma in 1954. And boy, was everything not ethical in the 50s when it comes to research. Now, the goal of this research, and if you remember, we need to ensure that it's going to maximize the benefits, not only that participant, but also the greater population. So the goal specifically was to understand and manipulate prejudice. The problem with that, the ethical concern, was that now we have basically fostered prejudice in young persons, in children. A way to mitigate, if you remember, we have the benefit here, because the goal is to understand prejudice, but we had to minimize the amount of harm that we can cause to an individual, the amount of risk. So for example, their resolution was to deal with prejudice before the actual study ended. Any questions about that? So notice that there was an inherent level of risk because I am working with children in regards to prejudice. So yes, there is a level of risk. But notice that they attempted to reduce that risk. Now, this one is really interesting. It's a really interesting example. Many of you have probably heard about the Milgram experiments. Now, who can tell me about the Milgram experiments? Right? Yes, ma'am.
They had the participants come in and they had a manager research that was kind of the person on the other side of the world. They had questions and everything they got it wrong, shocking. And every time we got it wrong, shocking. Because fake versus screaming. And they didn't have that.
Okay. What's your last name?
Boucher.
What's your first name?
Kara.
Kara. So Dr. Kara over here is letting us know that in this experiment, we had a form of deception, right? Because we have a participant who is supposedly providing a punishment to another person who is a Confederate, right? And this person is in on the experiment. They're actually faking that every time our participant presses a button, they're giving him a shock, right? An electrical shock. The problem was that the intent wasn't to measure the person's ability to answer questions right or wrong. The main objective of this research was obedience. So not only do we have deception, because we didn't let the person know what the true objective was, we also had a Confederate, right? A Confederate, it's someone that is within the research, right? That is aware of the research. But we don't let that person know, the person that's participating, that there is a Confederate. The goal of this study was to understand obedience by an authority figure. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the research, we had our participant, and our participant was sitting next to a person wearing a white coat. And a white coat, generally, we associate that with some sort of authority because we believe they're medical doctors, we believe they're researchers or scientists. So we immediately associate this type of clothing as a figure of authority. So this person would request to the participant, go ahead and shock them. And every time they would increase the voltage. And every time the participant would refuse, that person in an authority position would say, go ahead and shock them. The problem was, and even though there was no real shock, the problem was that this was causing severe stress to that participant because they truly believed that they were causing harm to that Confederate. They truly believed that was simply another participant. Now, this study remains controversial, but it also demonstrated how willing we are, how willing a person can be in providing harm with another person, even though it didn't seem like it aligned with their moral views. This experiment is often cited as a method to explain the compliance of the German populace with Nazi policies. And a lot of them would say that it wouldn't align with their moral views, but it ended up happening. And this experiment is usually one of the things that we like to utilize when we're trying to explain compliance through obedience and an authority figure. Now, they attempted to resolve the situation by disclosing that there were in fact no shocks ever administered to the individual. And you can say, well, that takes care of that. It's like, whoo, I wasn't actually shocking an individual. Let's say later on you go home and you start to meditate and think about what you just did. You were willingly shocking a person. You literally thought you were harming another person. And that can cause stress, thinking, I was able to do that. Nothing stopped me. Nothing coerced me in sense of physical harm, of course, because there was, of course, psychological coercion. That could cause stress. Going back home and thinking, wow, I was actually shocking this person. I actually believed that I was doing it and I kept doing it. Some of that to the max, to the maximum voltage, if you will, until the Confederate would not scream any longer. Basically providing the illusion that they had either passed out or died. A lot of people went through that lethal maximum of shock that wasn't really occurring. But imagine, say, for example, that person's understanding later on about their own moral code or a willingness to hurt another person. So think about, even if I disclose that, there's still a large ethical element to this. Any questions about that? Fantastic. Now, this is another significant study, Stanford prison study. Has anybody heard about that? Is anybody familiar with it? Yes, ma'am.
When there was a group of people randomly assigned to either be the prison guards or the prisoners, and they were taken to the basement, and it was set up to be sort of like a jail, like a prison, and left to its own devices to see how everyone would react in such a situation. And then they terminated it like after 6 days because it got so rough.
So, what's your first name?
Joanna.
Dr. Joanna over here. She's mentioning that a group of students were randomly assigned to being either a correctional officer or being an inmate. But of course, it's fake, right? It's random assignment. They weren't actually in prison. They were actual correctional officers. And in this case, what Dr. Joanna was mentioning, she noted that we have placed people in a position of authority. And now we have individuals that we have placed in a non-autonomous position. And we just wanted to see what would happen. And what happened did happen, because the students had a badge, had the sunglasses, basically things that we associate with authority. They had uniforms and they had a badge. Similar to the previous study we were talking about, the white coat portraying some sort of authority. This actually led to these individuals abusing the persons that we associated with less autonomy, in this case, the students who were assigned to that inmate group. And as she mentioned, we actually had to terminate that study early because they realized the potential consequences, particularly the welfare of the participants on both sides, but more specifically that of the prisoner participants. Any questions about that? Fantastic. Now, something that we generally want to do whenever we are in an institution is that we have IRBs. And this stands for Institutional Review Board. It's basically an extension to the 3 principles to that report that I was mentioning earlier. The person being able to have autonomy, the person being able to minimize the harm, maximize the risk. The IRB, the Institutional Review Board, their job is to ensure that those parameters are met in your study. Most universities, if not all universities, have them. And they're trying to ensure that the integrity, that autonomy of that individual, based on APA standards, we're trying to ensure that that is maintained within the participants and it is not lost because of unethical procedures within your study. The process is tedious. The process is difficult because it is their job to ensure that there's no unethical issues within your study. It is required if that institution receives federal funding. The individuals will also become reviewers of your research protocols. Are you dealing with children? Are you dealing with the elderly? Are you dealing with vulnerable populations? So for example, inmates are considered a vulnerable population because they've been stripped from their freedom. Right, so an inmate would be considered vulnerable. A child would be considered vulnerable. An elderly person, generally defined as a person above the age of 64. And here in our state, a child is anyone under the age of 19, not 18, for those of you who didn't know. In our state is the age of 19, but basically the rest of America tends to be 18. Yes, ma'am.
I'm working with like children and vulnerable populations. Are the researchers considered like mandated reporters when stuff happens in the study?
Are researchers considered?
Mandated reporters.
So that's a good question. Are you considered a mandated reporter should something come across,
I
right?
assume that like if something within the study happens, then you obviously have to say something, but if it's like with children and stuff.
So in regards to a vulnerable population, you need to identify who has, I'll go back, who has the autonomy to make that informed decision, right? So in this case, we would define the parents as those who would have the autonomy to make that decision, right? So if something were to happen, that would probably be one of the first sources to go to, because the research participant, and in this case, the autonomous party, which is the parent, or say, for example, someone who has custody. You know, maybe you're trying to deal with someone who has a learning disability and they're an adult, but they have a custodian. So that would also be a vulnerable population. You would have to let, I think the term, I'm trying to remember the term for it. The vested parties, i.e. mom and dad, what's going on in the research. So you would report it. Does that answer your question? It gets a little trickier than that, especially if you hold a license, because now we need to understand what's the duty to not harm, right? So if you find out extra information, then you follow your ethical guidelines. Right? So if you have to report the authorities, you follow the legal guidelines, you have to report it to somebody else, to Child Protective Services, things of that nature. Does that answer your question? Good deal. Now, something really interesting about the IRB is that it will look for specific factors. One of them is that you are providing accurate information. You are providing accurate information to the institution, but more importantly, are you providing accurate information to the participant? Because remember, they have to make that informed decision. They need to know what they're getting themselves into. So if you don't give them accurate information, they cannot make a willing decision, an informed decision of what is it that you are intending to do. This has to occur before approval, right? Before you can even contact a participant, before you can even reach out to your pool of participants. This approval occurs before you even see that first person. This does not occur after. This occurs before you talk to that individual, before you even start recruiting your sample. You are also mandated to conduct this research as approved. And that is immensely important. And what do I mean by that? It has to be conducted as approved. Once you receive the approval from the IRB, and say in your methods, you said that you were going to recruit your participants from, say, here in a psychology class, all psychology classes, or one-on-one classes. But then you are approved for that, to recruit participants in the one-on-one classes here on campus. But then you decide, I'm gonna post this on TikTok. I'm gonna post this link on TikTok. Many people want to participate, or Facebook. For us, for those of us who are a little older, refuse to start a TikTok account. Notice that that wasn't approved. That was not how your research was approved in the first place. And that could be an ethical concern. Not only that, it can ultimately affect your study because, you know, who knows who you are recruiting to TikTok because you had identified your sample already as undergrad students from 101. So not only is it not beneficial for you, it's also unethical because it wasn't approved. And you're not conducting it as approved. You would actually have to send a revision to the IRB if that were the case. I've been through that process. It is difficult. But it's a good thing that it's actually difficult. Any questions about that? Fantastic. interestingly, when we're trying to fuse the IRB with our code, we find significant points. One of them being, first, we had our IRB approval. Secondly, we provide that informed consent. And what do I mean by that? Here, we are actually letting the person know these are your patient rights. This is what is expected of the research. These are my responsibilities as a researcher. These are your responsibilities as a participant. And this is voluntary. You are here to participate voluntarily, and you can remove that consent at any point. Just because you agreed to participate in my study, it doesn't mean you have to remain in my study. And that has to be communicated in the informed consent. Not only that, you also have to let them know the level of risk that that person is getting themselves into, and also the level of reward that they may be receiving. Later on, you're actually going to conduct the procedures as approved by the IRB, and you are required to provide a debriefing. And what is that? Well, say you start a study and you're looking for, what's your last name, sir?
Gray.
Grant?
Gray, like the color.
Gray.
You know, the Army says I'm not deaf from service.
They really say that. I'm trying to think that test wasn't really accurate. Everybody at home tells me the same thing. But anyway, Dr. Gray over here mentioned studies of OCD. And I'm going to recruit participants from the one-on-one course have been formally diagnosed with OCD. And I conduct my study. You also have to give them a chance to be able to communicate with you after the study, because they also have the right to the results of the study, which is why we have debriefings. They are actually entitled to see what came up. What happened with the study? What did you find out? You have to provide them the opportunity to be able to contact you or your supervisor, because you will have a supervisor. Generally, we usually do that in form of a summary. You wouldn't give them raw data, right? Because that would infringe upon the rights of other people who participated, right? So you generally give them a summary. What did you find? What was the research questions? Things of that nature. They are actually entitled to that. And you have to give them the opportunity within the informed consent. This is the email. This is the contact number. These are the people you can contact. Any questions about that? Fantastic. Okay. Now, there are several instances and several aspects that we need to be able to provide consent for. One of them, we have some special cases, that is recording voices and or images, right? That's a special circumstance because that will require additional informed consent, right? Not only am I willing to participate in your study, I'm also willing for you to record my voice, to record a video, to record images. So that's a special circumstance. You actually have to mention that to that participant because, again, they are entitled legally to know what exactly are you trying to gather. In this case, it seems it can be recording voices. Another interesting ethical concern, and a lot of people forget about that, is that client, patient, student, subordinate, research participants. You're wondering, why is that a problem? That sounds like a really good pool to draw from, right? Right now, I have close to 300 students this semester. That sounds like a good pool, huh? That's 300 people. But notice that our relationship is that of faculty-student, not researcher-participant. That puts me in an ethical dilemma. Now I need to ensure that your participation, that you're not viewing it as a student-faculty relationship. I need to ensure that you don't feel coerced into participating in that study. Well, Dr. Shar said that
she's conducting a research. I guess I should do it.
There is an ethical concern when you have subordinates, right? So for example, a faculty member towards a student, a practitioner towards their clients or their patients, a supervisor towards the people they supervise. Because now we're changing that role. We're changing it from supervisor to supervisee. Now we're changing it from researcher to participant.
These are two separate roles and they involve ethical concerns.
Are you being coerced into participating? And remember, your participation has to be voluntary.
Yes, ma'am.
Would like the promise of extra credit or even money be coercion?
That's a good question. What do you guys think?
Show of hands. Is it ethical? Right? Say, for example, good old Dr. Shaw over here says, if you participate in my study, you get extra credit. Who thinks that's ethical? Raise your hand. Nobody thinks that's ethical. One person. All right. Two, then kind of. All right. So we'll say like about a third of the class. Yes, ma'am.
Does that limit like people trying their best, like trying to ace the research?
What about money? Is it ethical for me to say, if you participate in my study, you're gonna get $20 for just talking to me for 10 minutes? Talking for me with me for 10 minutes, you're gonna get $20. That's more than people get paid an hour. This minimum wage is $7.25, right? Right? What do you guys think? Is that ethical for me to say that? So not one person here thinks it's ethical. About 10th of the class, right? Thinks it's ethical. The answer to that, you have to measure how great is the reward. Is this reward too great in comparison to what the person is doing? If I say, if you guys participate in my study, you get extra credit, it could be 10 points, it could be 20 points. But if I say, if you participate in my study, you get an A. That's too great of a reward. That would be considered a form of coercion, because who can resist that, right? Is it truly voluntary? Are you truly participating because, oh, let's see what this is about? Instead of, and on the side I get a couple points versus, well, sign me up because I'm gonna get an A in the class for talking to Dr. Shaw for 10. That's too great of a reward. And money is the same thing. I've seen it a lot with gift cards, generally. You get a $50 gift card for Amazon, for example. You get a $50 card for Walmart.
So the reward cannot be too great.
Because now it's seen as a form of coercion.
Is it really that you want to participate in my study, or is it that you want to make $20 for talking to me 10 minutes? Sweet deal.
Right? Does that answer your question? What was your question, ma'am? Remember? And you'll see that a lot. A lot of faculty members would say, and actually, for my 101 and 102 course, faculty, I don't have any research going on, but we do have a campus-wide research, right? So 101 and 102 students, R&D provided that opportunity to be participants. And it's extra credit. That's what they get. Not a whole A. I would have done that. Sign me up. Okay. And this is what we were talking about just now, about there's a good risk of coercion. I have another question. What about if it's not money, it's not extra credit? How about I am conducting research and say with an elderly person, an inmate, a child, right? Someone who's at risk, and there's no money, there's no extra credit. But I say, if while participating in my study, we're going to talk for about 6 hours every day. Is that ethical? With a person who's vulnerable? Or is it a form of coercion? What do you guys think? That's a goodie. See the gears turning. Got oil in your lamp. I see that bulb, Yes, ma'am.
Wouldn't it be coercive since they're at risk
would argue it could be a form of coercion. Why is that, right? It's a form of coercion because here's this person, this elderly person who has no family and is by themselves. And here you are promising your whole attention for a day. Are they really wanting to participate in your research? Or oh, let me talk to this young lady. She seems nice, right? So notice how it doesn't even have to be money. Attention could be a form of coercion. Right? And inmates, for example, like our friend here mentioned, they generally don't have the opportunity to talk to people from what they would refer to as the outside world. So is your interaction with this person, is this person truly doing it voluntarily or simply because they want to get out of themselves and talk to an ordinary, basic, average person? You guys are not basic because you're in my class, but I'm referring to nobody's here. We're all kings and queens. Just making that clear. I'm the empress, am I right? Any questions about that? Yes, ma'am.
I don't know the children, what would that, how would it be coercion with children?
Interestingly, children crave attention because they're learning, first of all. Everything you say would be absorbed by this child. And for all we know, say, for example, we're finding a neglected kid. When we're conducting this type of experiment or research, is it truly that they're wanting to participate? Or is it because mom and dad are trying to get rid of the kid for a while? So those are factors that you need to ask yourself. Whether or not this participation is being provided in an autonomous way. Any more questions? Fantastic. I like to bring attention as a time spent with a person, because a lot of people forget that. You mean a lot to participants because you yourself are in a position of authority. So a lot of people will take what you say to heart, and that time that you spend with them can also be seen as a sort of token, if you will, as a reward, even though you didn't give them 1 cent. Now, another interesting factor about APA code and IRB is deception. Who can tell me what deception is in research? What does it sound like? First of all, let's do it in another area. What's deception in general? Like, let's think about dictionary term. What does that mean to you?
Not telling the whole truth.
Not telling the whole truth. I like that. Anybody else? I like that a lot. Not telling the whole truth. That's exactly what it is. Deception is not letting that participant know a specific or many factors about the research. If you remember from earlier, I was mentioning that you need to be able to make an informed decision. You need to be able to know what you're getting yourself into when we are talking about research. But notice that in some cases, we actually conduct deception in research. What does that mean? I actually did not provide you during the informed consent with everything that you needed to know. For example, I can be talking about, say, and this is an example that I gave with my other students in my 101 class. Poor little chickadees, am I right? When I gave them this example, poor little things. So say, for example, I am interested in, say, for example, in, let's say 300 people, 300 students, there we go. Say I want to study the sexual behaviors and fetishes of my students. Say I'm interested in that. She's looking at me like, what? Why would you want to do that? I don't. First of all, let me just make that very clear. You know, it's a whole different generation, it's everything. But I love you guys. So let's suppose that I'm trying to find out, say for example, BDSM, any sort of fetish that you may have. I may not tell you that in your informed consent. I'm not going to tell you, this study is to conduct research about your sexual fetishes and masochism and sadism that you may have every day. I won't tell you that. I may say, this study is to understand your sleep patterns or your behaviors before you go to sleep. Because the average person generally tends to have sex before at night and late. So you may think, oh, that's what she wants. She just wants to know what I'm doing. In reality, I use deception. My real research question
Was about your fetishes. And you're thinking, how is that ethical, right? Because she is not telling me exactly
what you wanted to study. In order to use deception, first of all, it has to be approved. I cannot simply tell the IRB, oh, I'm just going to study, don't worry about it. I'm going to study about sexual fetishes with my students. And yeah, that's what I'm going to tell them. And in reality, I never told them. That has to be approved by the IRB. One of the things they're going to look into is deception truly necessary? Is deception truly the only way that you can study that variable? Is it truly necessary? Can I study about your fetishes without being deceitful? Generally, we use deception when we're trying to observe that behavior naturally. We're trying to stop you from showing the better version of yourself. I don't want Dr. Shar knowing that I like feet, right? I don't want her to know that. I actually met someone who liked chins. That was her fetish. Very oddly specific, isn't it? But there is no way, or the average person would likely not feel comfortable with disclosing something like that. So maybe deception would be the best way to find out this information. Also, when there is deception, I have to use this deception, but it doesn't imply a risk to you, right? It doesn't imply that there's an inherent risk for you because you don't know exactly what's going on. Had you known what's going on, the level of risk decreases. Therefore, that wouldn't be ethical. That level of deception wouldn't be ethical because now you are at risk of whichever it may be, physical harm, psychological harm. So if the deception involves a risk in your decision-making, that it wouldn't be approved. And the last aspect about deception is that I must tell you what's going on the second I am able to. The second I am able to, I have to tell you exactly what the true intention was, whether it be the research method, whether it be the research question, whatever it is that I kept from you in that informed consent, the second I am able to tell you, I will tell you. That is a main requirement, one of the big requirements for us to use deception. Now, another method that I like to think about is, let's talk about, say, I'll give you an example of deception. Out of 300 people, right? I want to study this new therapeutic method, right? And this new therapeutic method, it's geared towards persons with couples, right? With couples problems, with their wife, spouse, their babe, their boo, whatever, boo-hoo, whatever their relationship is. And this new treatment method, I want to test it out with people who have issues with their significant other. So half of them, for example, are going to receive that treatment. So remember that that's your experimental group. And then the other half are just going to receive traditional treatment methods, therapeutic methods that are not necessarily geared towards helping them with their spouse or boyfriend, girlfriend, babe, what's another one? Boo, anybody else?
Baby.
Hmm?
Baby.
Whatever it is. This other treatment method is not either. Not only that, I don't tell them. I don't tell them that the treatment they're going to be going through, say, for 3 months, with twice a week of their time going to therapy, twice a week out of their time, thinking that they're actually getting therapy to do a little better in their relationship. Is that ethical? You can tell me. The other group is receiving the treatment that I'm trying to test out to see if it'll work. Yes,
That's
ma'am.
not ethical,
Why not?
because they think they're receiving a benefit that they're not receiving.
Right. But think about, what is the risk? What is the risk of them not knowing? Right? What is the risk of them not knowing that they're not receiving the treatment.
They can think they're getting something or not.
Right. Alternatively, what you could do is provide them equal treatment, right? Provide them with something that will be equivalent to that treatment method after the study, to provide them with the opportunity to say, you know what, it's 3 months, we're receiving basic level therapy, not specifically geared towards couples, but now you're going to receive therapy that is specifically geared towards couples. So you would stop the deception the second you can. So in that case, you would provide them with therapy that has been, for example, empirically tested to help with couples. Any questions about that? Going once, twice. Fantastic. Now let's talk a little bit about debriefing. One of the most important things, as I mentioned, is that you will have participants that want to know what happened with that study, guys. I participated in this thing for 3 months and I want to know what she found out. Are my bae and I going to be together? Or something like that along those lines, which of course I wouldn't be able to answer, but here we are, right? You have to let them know in their informed consent that they do indeed have the right to find out about their information. Generally, this is intended to answer their research, their actual questions. It's also intended to reduce harm and risk of the participant. Another thing, it is also intended to protect the participant. And lastly, part of your debriefing should also include, let's identify that confederate, should there be a confederate in your study. Because a confederate is a method of deception, inherently. And this is a good one. Anonymity versus confidentiality. Why are they different? Why are these two different? Don't they sound the same? Why are these two different and have two separate definitions in this slide? Why do you guys think, or do you guys think it's the same? What can you guys tell me?
Anonymity would be like protecting the participant's identity versus confidentiality, protecting their personal information.
So our friend, what's your last name?
Countryman,
What's your first name?
and friends, Romans, countryman, last name is countryman.
Countryman. Oh, that's unique. I like it. Are you like a country girl or you're just like, no, I'm a city girl. I grew up in Chicago.
Antonio.
So she's saying that one protects confidential information. Like, for example, let's say identifying information like your social, things like that. What say you, ma'am?
Anonymity is more so no one being aware of who the person is. So it's like, I throw out these surveys, whoever picks it up, you pick it up and put it in the box, but I don't see who it is, versus confidentiality, is you know who that person is, therefore you have to protect that information and therefore not reveal it to anyone.
Okay. What's your last name?
Peterson.
Peterson. So Dr. Peterson over here is saying one involves absolutely no knowledge about who or what or whatever piece of information that we have to identify the individual. Whereas on the other hand, what we are experiencing is we do know something. We do know something that could potentially identify this person. So we have to keep it protected from leaving the study. And that's exactly it. That is the difference. The difference is that with anonymity, everything, right? It is unknown to me, right? It is unknown who this person is. So for example, in your survey at the end of the semester, so that little old me can't get hired again, right? I won't know who posted that. I will have no idea which student was it. It won't have your A number. It won't have your last name. It won't have what you look like. I would not have any knowledge as to who you are. That's anonymity. Generally, that's a higher, stricter standard. Whereas with confidentiality, on the other hand, there is a way to identify you. There is a way. So for example, say during your study, right? You signed up, right? And there's a sign-in sheet. And then when you sign in, okay, I was the first to sign in, so I got a number 1, and I'm the second one, so number 2. And then you use, I'm going to be number 1, and I'm going to be number 2, and I'm going to be number 3. That is a way for me to be able to identify. I can say the guy that scored high on the OCD examination, the guy that had a lot of fetishes, if I go, oh, it's number 3. Oh, it's Mr. Jared over here, right? Mr. Jared has a foot fetish, right? Because I'm able to identify Mr. Jared has a foot fetish, I need to keep this information confidential and not have that information leave the study, because there is a way to identify it, right? The problem with that is, of course, that if that material gets compromised, somebody could actually read through and say, let me see who has OCD. Let me see who's into BDSM. And a lot of people, whenever they're conducting a study, that's what they fear. They fear that they will be able to be identified, and then somebody outside of the research experience would be able to gather that information, because nobody wants their information out there. Or let me take that back. Some people do. That's why we have TikTok and Facebook and Twitter, because you do want your information to be out there. It's like, I want to be private, but then posting yourself. Any questions about that? Fantastic. This is a really interesting topic, and it's very touchy for many individuals. And that is animals that are subjected to research. We do conduct animal studies in psychology, generally because first of all, some of the structures in the brain are similar, so that's one reason. Another reason is because some of the behaviors can be extrapolated and translated into human behavior. We also conduct animal studies when it comes to, say, for example, the potential risk that it may pose to a human being. So, what are the advantages of animal research? It's that we have the ability to control and to eliminate potential variables or moderating variables, your confounding variables. We're able to minimize or eliminate all of those variables so that I can only observe that independent variable and that dependent variable. How difficult would that be if I tried to grab a baby from birth, right, and conduct a study? There are people who have done that, though, in psychology, having a child from birth and observing this child their entire life. It has happened. How ethical is that? Not at all. Researchers have done it in psychology with their own children. Their children turn into participants. So instead of being a father to their children, they were the researcher of their children. Would that be ethical? So that's one of the reasons why we conduct certain studies with animals, because we, first of all, more importantly, we're able to control those differences of nurture. Right? We can also control for genetic differences. So not only are we concerned with nurture, we're also concerned with nature. We're able to do that with animals. I know there's a lot of genetic engineering that has occurred with humans, but ultimately, generally, these studies are conducted with animals. We can control that environment. It would be immensely difficult to control the environment of every single participant. Even here, this is a smaller size classroom. It would be immensely difficult for me to be able to have control with all those variables. Like, say, Dr. Smith over here had a bad day, and then Dr. Countryman, and then Dr. Countryman had a good day. How am I going to control for those two differences? That would be immensely difficult. But if I had animal participants, that would be a little bit easier to control. Any questions about advantages in utilizing animals as subjects? And again, animals are generally referred as subjects and persons are generally referred to as participants. Because a participant provided consent to participate, whereas an animal is subjected to research, to that participation before they didn't provide consent. That's a little distinct, little note that I like to make. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Now, there are many aspects that need to be covered when we are talking about the risk of an animal, right? Because they have to be treated in a humane aspect. I'm going to leave this on the screen. And if there's any, and for those of you who are watching online, any particular point, these questions have to be proposed before, remember with the IRB, before you conduct a study, you also have to find out, is there any alternate methods? And that could be the opposite. Can I do a statistical procedure instead of having an animal as a subject, right? Can I find out the same information with, say, a human that can provide consent? Can I find out the same information through a statistical procedure? So I'm going to give you guys a second to read and go through these. And for those of you watching at home, you can pause the screen. Anyone here specifically that you would like me to cover more in detail? Yes, sir. Which number is that?
What was that?
Which number is that?
Number 8.
8. Number 8 reads, what is the plan for caring for animals following the procedure? Remember how we talked about autonomy? We talked about dignity. That animal, whatever methods that animal was subjected to, just like we have that responsibility of minimizing risk for a human, we also have that obligation, say, for example, to debrief, right? So after the procedure is conducted. In an analogous fashion, we have to provide the IRB with what is going to happen after the study. So for example, are the animals going to be euthanized after the study? Are there animals going to receive some sort of level of care to reduce, for example, pain that they are experiencing? So similar to a human participant, say for example, you experience stress, right? Say for example, finding out, wow, I thought that Dr. Shah was studying about my sleep issues and it was really about my fetishes. That can cause stress. What am I going to do with that distress afterwards? In a similar fashion, what am I going to do with the level of distress that that animal experienced? Does that answer your question? Yes, ma'am.
Number 11.
All right. So for number 11, that reads, for surgical studies, are sedation, analgesia, or anesthesia appropriate? Notice that whenever possible, we have to reduce the level of harm and pain and suffering that that animal is experiencing, whenever possible. In some studies, that might not be the case, right? Maybe they are indeed studying pain in an animal, right? So is that option feasible? Can I provide some level of peace and comfort during the study, right? Especially for surgery. So that would be a question to answer for the IRB. Are you able to provide some sort of sedation for this animal?
What's the second word in the list?
So when we have forms of sedation, it's basically a synonym for all of them. Basically a method to reduce the pain with that. Let's say a better term would be reduce the level of awareness of that individual. Let's say that. Like alcohol, for example. Right? Things don't hurt when you're drunk, huh? Don't drink, kids. Don't do it. Don't do it. I don't want you to go to the boss and say, Dr. Sharson. I didn't say that. I did not. Don't drink, kids. Don't do it. Any other questions? Fantastic. Now, one of the last things that I'd like to cover is the humane care of animals. We have to ensure that that level of care, not only before the research, not only during research, but before the research. For example, UH didn't have an animal facility, animal research facility. We simply didn't have one until we did. Somebody was like, hey, we're not doing studies with animals. What's up with that? Before that, there are many laws that have to be considered before we even start conducting studies with animals. Are the facilities humane? How often are they being cleaned? The level of, say, for example, entertainment, human contact, food. That is before we even consider starting doing animal trials or research. Also, generally, studies are conducted or supervised by an individual who is already experienced in that field. I, myself, I would not consider myself someone capable of doing such thing because there's probably better individuals who have made it, for example, their life goal to study and conduct research with animals. They have gained the training and the experience to do so. So that's really important, by the way, recognizing what your limitations are. That's okay. That is totally fine. And if one of them is you're not experienced in dealing with animals, you should bring that up. Same goes for the client. If you think that treating someone with schizophrenia may be outside of your scope, let your supervisor know. And make sure that the individuals who are indeed conducting and training and handling the animals are in fact trained, are in fact certified, right? Wouldn't want Billy Bob, hey, Billy Bob, here's $10. Go ahead and handle these animals. Because unfortunately, that would not necessarily be, let's say this person's not trained to deal with this animal humanely. All right, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
How are IRBs chosen or created?
Generally, one of the first things that they will do, they will find who the expert in that field is. So for example, if here in the university, we don't have a person who does animal research, then we probably can't conduct animal research because there's not at least one person in the IRB that knows what the study implies, the level of risk. Generally, it is selected based on the individuals who indeed have training in identifying specialized training, I should say, first and foremost on ethical codes, and that they're also experts in their field, right? I wouldn't be part of an IRB board for animal research when I am not an expert in it. That in and by itself will make it unethical, wouldn't it? Like, yeah, sure, go ahead, study these giraffes, and there's only like 3 of them left, but I had no idea, right? Any other questions? Fantastic. I hope this was a beautiful learning experience, and I'll see you next time.